From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Dale Blasi will talk about protein supplementation for the cow herd during the remainder of the summer grazing season, how that can pay off in building up that cow or heifer's body condition heading into the fall and winter. Also today, highlights from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber respond to a listener question about the importance of the weaning weight trait in herd genetic selection. And further ahead on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton will talk about current insect and disease problems in home vegetable gardens and how to go about controlling those. All that and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Thanks for tuning in for this Thursday edition of Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. This first segment is for you cattle producers with stock out on grass right now. It's been a better than decent grazing season for a lot of Kansas producers, but we might be entering the time now where due consideration might be given to providing a supplement to those cattle on grass. And we'll explore that right here with K-State Research and Extension beef cattle nutritionist Dale Blasi. So, Dale, your assessment of the grazing season so far as you view it. With the moisture we've had, at least by volume, really good grass productivity, have we not?
We have, and I would also say, Eric, the opportunity for a lot of that washiness in the grass. And so, it goes on a case-by-case basis, but generally we see a lot of washiness. We don't get the concentration, but while we have recouped a lot of body condition, I really don't know how much we've seen that in terms of added performance, especially for our grazing stockers.
Now, when you say washiness, you're talking about the content of the grass itself, the protein levels?
The nutrient, yes, the watered down impacts from the moisture that we've received, and also the acceleration of the plant to mature much quicker through the growing season, especially since we've seen these hot temperatures over the last 3 or 4 weeks.
To the point where providing a supplement might be in order? Let's start with the cow-calf herd.
Well, a lot of producers, we had that winter feeding year that was pretty dramatic. A lot of folks have forgotten in Kansas what a potential winter can be like, and that long, protracted winter had an obvious impact on body condition of our cows, and the story is still out in terms of their repeat, the breeding, and the success of the cows introducing everything with the bulls and all. But I think there's a great opportunity now for cows, especially our younger females, to really build and pack some body condition on those cows. So, cows that are today certainly in excess of 5, that would be a questionable thing to be considering, but body condition wise, but certainly for our younger age females, from now through first frost is a great opportunity to put on flesh for our cows as they move into the winter feeding system. I mean, many of our animals today, for our spring calving cows, they're in that first trimester, and with the advancing gestation of the cow and with the challenging environmental elements, it's much, much harder to try to recoup body condition as we move into the November, Decembers, and certainly into the first part of the year. Now is the time to think of that as a recharge the battery of the cow. And coming back with protein will enhance and improve digestibility of this lower quality material. Certainly there's a lot of opportunity for animals, if they're given free access and adequate, they're not stocked too heavy, to selectively graze down into the draws and find some of the cool season plants that might be growing and obtain some protein there. But I think it's, in many cases, I think there's a good opportunity to recoup body condition with the use of protein to unlock, if you will, the energy that's in that lower quality grass.
So for the bred cow, the bred heifer, what form of supplementation, what feed stuff would be the optimum for accomplishing this build back in body condition?
A great question. And, this fall time, many folks, besides being cattle producers, are obviously crop producers as well. And so you start injecting in how many hours in a day, especially if you have harvest and everything to concern yourselves with. I've maintained, and there can be opportunities to look at some of the self-fed supplements that are out there. I'm not advocating. I'm just saying if there was a time where you could justify, and we always have this internal debate about whether it's a convenience item or if it's a labor-saving tool. And if a producer factors in his or her time in terms of the amount of time to deliver supplement to animals, the wear and tear on vehicles, and everything that goes along with that, I think there's a great opportunity to actually account for that and justify its use.
Mm-hmm. So liquid supplements or dry supplements, whatever works?
Yeah, I'm not going to split hairs between the two. I think as long as the consumption was held in check with what recommendations are, I mean, we don't want them to run off. I somehow feel that the atmospheric, the hard-pressed blocks, if you will, perhaps would do a better job of limiting the consumption as opposed to the liquid, as opposed to a cow just staying there and just slurping to town, if you will. I think there's a little bit of effort that's required with some of those blocks that are produced under pressure. And I think it's something to consider. Now, on the other side of the coin, we did some work at the Stocker unit about 7 or 8 years ago where we supplemented daily, every other day, and every 3 days. And we saw a comparable response by going back every 3 days. So, again, an opportunity to keep an eye on your cattle, get a head count, all those things kind of go along that are part of being a good manager, and you're seeing the animals and you're aware of what's going on. We see a comparable response if we were to supplement every 3 days, if you will.
But the point is, you do not, if you're uncomfortable with free choice, you don't have to go with a daily regimen.
That's correct.
You can break that out over several days.
That is absolutely correct. And that would be my recommendation if cows or younger age females are in marginal body condition and so forth. I think that now's a good time to be thinking about doing that.
Dale, how about stockers who'll be out on that grass for the full season? Some have been pulled off already in the double stocking arrangements, but for those who will be on grass for a while, supplementation pay off?
I suspect right now with the buy-sell and looking at beef basis to look at the value of gain by doing so, from this very study that I referenced just earlier, we saw a very slight but non-significant response, a very modest return. So the value of gain would have to be there, Eric, to really justify doing so, to get the performance. With corn surfacing around $4 a bushel and looking at roughly a tenth or 2/10 of a pound response over 60 days, and then factoring back the cost of delivery and mixing and so forth, that really is a marginal management practice I would even look at doing.
Your grass would have to be in pretty tough shape to make that pencil out.
Absolutely, and the other way of looking at it is perhaps stocking whatever grass trap you may have to a heavier degree to carry those animals. That might be another perspective to think how you're using that supplement, that grain-based supplement, if you will, to try to spare some of the grass and stretch it out for the larger number of cattle that are present.
All right. Well, we've been looking here at protein supplementation as a sidebar, if you will, Dale. We've been providing mineral supplementation, presumably, for stockers as well as the cow-calf herd since the beginning of the grazing season. Do you see any need at this stage for amending that supplementation at all or adding to it?
I would not. I would hold consistent. Everything falls with declining grass quality in terms of existing copper and zinc, and some of the phosphorus as well will decline over time. I think maintaining that, it depends on the extent of the grazing season in terms of going into dead grass. How long is a producer going to do it? First of the year. So if you look at a traditional full season grazing season. We're talking somewhere in that October-November time frame. Given that we got 60 or 90 days, I think it's more important to monitor the consumption of whatever mineral supplement you use and try to stay within whatever the manufacturer's recommendations are, because a lot of them will formulate to meet 50% of the animal's needs, if you will. And if the animals are consuming in excess of that, there's probably a salt requirement that they're striving for to consume for salt. And as a consequence, you're actually spending more money for that salt. It may be good to keep salt blocks out there in addition to a complete mineral as well.
Right. But across the board here, it's about economizing with whatever one does in supplementation.
Absolutely. And looking at the value of gain. And again, the colleagues over in Ag Econ have developed an excellent tool that I reference quite frequently, looking at what the relative buy and what the sell price of the animal is. And of course, they're pinging off of the corn value to give us an idea of what the value of gain is. And if you look at, a response of, say, a half a pound over 100 days, that's 50 pounds. And you could look at what that value of gain is. And if your cost of production is less than what that value of gain is, there's some opportunity, some reason to take pause and consider looking at that management strategy.
And by the way, producers, if you'd like to access that beef basis tool, it's at agmanager.info. Very well. And Dale, we will next see you for sure at the Beef Stalker Field Day coming up in September, and we'll be previewing that as we get closer to that time, but producers need to get that on their calendar.
Yes, September 19th, and we're going to have a very, very special field day this year with certified Angus beef prime. We're going to have served steaks instead of briskets. And as always, we strive to do our level best to get the best in programming for people to show up. So mark your calendar, September 19th.
And we'll have you back before then to give a full preview of that event. Dale, thank you for coming by as always. Dale Blasi, beef cattle nutritionist here at K-State. Protein supplementation considerations for cattle on grass as we move into the latter stages of the summer grazing season. Agriculture Today will be back after this. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now. When it comes to beef cattle genetic selection, there's rarely a lack of things to talk about given the avalanche of information at you cattle producers' disposal. To that end, the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State engages in a healthy dialogue on the subject, stemming from a question from a podcast listener. Aboard this time around, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber and veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White. As always, Brad kicks off the conversation.
Our question from a listener, and I really appreciate when you guys send in questions because it gives us good talking points. The question is, we've made a lot of genetic advancement since the 80s or 70s or even in the last 10 years, and we especially see that in the areas of yearling weight, carcass weight, some of those end performance characteristics. But it doesn't seem like weaning weight has moved up as much as the other two characteristics. Why? What do you guys think's going on?
Well, first of all, I'm going to agree with this listener, and there's actually been a couple of neat reports coming out, one out of North Dakota and one coming out of Texas, that basically said the same thing, that even though our EPDs for growth traits, such as weaning weight and yearling weight and carcass weight, have really made some nice advances, and we'll start with maybe in the 80s, and it probably extends before that. But weaning weights, actual weaning weights brought to the sale barn have not increased during that same time frame. And so obviously there's some genetic improvement in growth traits, but it's not necessarily expressing itself in that first 200 days of life.
I would agree with the listener, and there's been some some increase in
But now, are you agreeing with that? So weaning weights haven't improved, or weaning weight genetics haven't improved, or are those the same thing?
Oh, I think those are different things. So weaning weight genetics have clearly improved because we know if we provide adequate nutrient.
So if you provide creep feed and plenty of,
If
creep
nutrients
forage
are
or
not
something.
limiting, we can make calves weigh a lot more now
did
than
in
we
the
could
80s.
in the 80s, right?
Okay.
Dr. Larson hit the nail on the head. Is in many cases we've improved the nutrient resource some for cows, particularly over winter. But if we think about how have we improved the nutrient availability of our grazed resource for many of us as spring calvers over the summer, that hasn't markedly changed. In fact,
and how could it? I mean, you're talking
Right.
about putting cattle out on grass.
Right.
And grass is almost identical to as it was in 1980.
and I would argue in many cases we know cow size has increased. There's a couple of reports that suggest that every 100 pounds of cow weight gets us somewhere between 6 and 12 pounds of additional calf weaning weight. So that's in the data, okay? But that's not a very big change, particularly over the time period that's seen that change in cow size. But if we have an adjusted stocking rate,
might be
nutrient
actually-
availability for cows actually
May go down.
may go down.
Because that 100 pounds of cow weight that she increases adds to her maintenance
requirement, exactly. So her ability to put nutrients towards calf lactation or available forage
For
for,
the calf?
calf to
Yeah, 'cause
graze
the calf's gonna
may
start
have actually
grazing.
gone down. So I don't disagree that we've not seen as big of change in weaning weights.
And
as
maybe
we have
part of
in-
this has to do with the fact that, and I remember being taught this in my animal breeding class, was, the trait that's expressed is both the genetics and the environment.
Exactly.
So the genetics has changed. We've got more growth genetics in these calves, but the environment has not changed. The calories available per bite for a grazing animal is exactly the same as it was in 1980.
So what I'm hearing you say, and you're gonna have to correct me here, because what I'm hearing you say is don't worry about genetics because the grass hasn't changed. Is that what you were saying?
No, but I'm not going to say that's not what I'm saying. In that, well, it has to
That's
do.
not what I was saying, but I'm not going to say it's not. Yeah, if you use enough negative,
Who's
you
on
can back
first?
into a good position. I like that.
So what I'm going to say is it's more complex than that. In that, if I'm selling at weaning, I may not be generating a lot more income from the improved growth genetics that have occurred in the last 40 years. If I retain ownership, even just for a few weeks past weaning through a growth phase or onto yearling or feedlot, then I capture that value.
Or
So
if I
think
sell
it's-
based on the reputation.
Or-
so
or
if I
if-
have that linkage somewhere in there, that can still help me.
And you could even say that kind of the rising tide floats all boats, and that the feedlots are basing, or the buyers are basing their prices on expected growth post-weaning. And so that, in a way, this growth genetics improvement that we're seeing that's really expressed once they get onto stocker or feedlot type rations, that's really expressed there, it is being built into the price, but it's spread across, so that it becomes the average for everybody. So if I've added better than average growth, I'm probably not getting really rewarded for that if I don't own them through that time period where they get
To express it.
where they can express it.
Yep.
So my answer was, it depends. But this question is, so am I really getting that much value from really improved growth genetics if I sell right at weaning? And I would say a little, but not a lot.
But you're also not, if you're, let's say you're selecting for breed average growth, whatever breed you buy.
Breed average has gone up too.
Breed average has gone up a lot, okay? But if you select for a lot below breed average growth, you're likely going to get to a spot where you decrease performance of your animals.
So that's not
and your
necessarily-
reputation will go down because you're breeding cattle
So
that
that's
don't
not
grow in the
necessarily
feed
good
yard.
advice either.
Right. So there's a likelihood that you get penalized in the market space for those calves that don't have adequate amount of growth.
So
that
if
makes
You
sense.
have to have a marketing program tied to where the genetics program is.
That would help. Yeah.
So that's I think that's part of it.
It's sort of like calf vaccination, right? It's expected now that you vaccinate calves for respiratory disease before you market them at weaning. If you don't, people find out and they don't pay.
You're going to
for
get
your
it. You're
calf.
maybe going to
You
get a
discount,
discount
yeah.
as you go forward. But I think that's part of the planning process. And I also think it is important if I want to capture more of that value. And you said this, Bob. I may have to own them more days.
Mm-hmm.
I may have to own them more days to get some of that value back out. And maybe that's backgrounding. Maybe that's ownership into the feed yard. But otherwise, the person on the other end, it's a little bit uncertain to them. If you know what you've got in there and you've got really good genetics, selling based on averages may not be to your benefit.
Right. If you're above average, I don't want to sell at the average.
So given all that we've said here, how do I pick which traits are most important for my operation? And I'm going to hone you in on a cow-calf operation selling at weaning.
All right.
How do I decide what's most important?
Well, first of all, that's a great question because it's mostly going to be expressed in the bulls we buy and somewhat on the heifers that we retain if we retain our own heifers, or the heifers we buy if we're buying outside the herd. So that's how I influence the genetics of the herd. And I think it's really important to recognize that there's going to be trade-offs. There's no animal out there that's above average for all traits, because there's a lot of traits that are antagonistic to each other. So if I am the best at milk production, I'm going to sacrifice something else, some other area of efficiency. So there is no bull out there that is above average for all traits. So it's always about compromise. So let's start with the conversation is you can't go for maximum. You're trying to optimize traits. And then from a business standpoint, you're trying to optimize income and expenses. So there's a bunch of traits that influence income and a bunch of traits that influence expenses.
So how do I figure out which are most important? And I understand the optimization part, but there's a lot of traits. I mean, you look at, if I'm looking at a bull catalog or I look online, there's a whole lot of things that I could think are important. How do I figure out which are most?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that just pops in my head is there's a fairly well-cited quote from Bob Tadashek, who's the former department head at Oklahoma State University, about cow-calf efficiency. And basically it's a really simple linear equation that's a function of how many calves did the cows have, how many cows were there, what's annual cow cost, and you subtract that from the revenue generated by the calves and the cows. Yep. So don't make this really complicated, because at the end of the day, the things that really drive cow-calf herd level profitability aren't complicated things. They're simple things like how many cows did I get settled?
So reproduction.
How many cows am I able to run in a given, for many of us, fixed land mass, right? So stocking rate or stocking density actually has a huge influence on ranch level profitability, because we think about, well, how many 1,100-pound cows can I run that wean, say, 450-pound calves versus 1,500-pound cows that may wean 500-pound calves. There's a big difference in the number I can run, and figuring out that optimization really affects ranch level profitability as I cover fixed costs versus the variable costs of individual cows. So
absolutely, and I think
made that complicated.
That's where don't make it too complicated. Focus on the big stuff. Yeah. Right? We've got to have a calf to sell.
So fertility and animal health are critical to have calves ready to sell.
So those are the traits, those are genetic traits that I should pick?
Yeah, primarily on fertility. So but there isn't a EPD for fertility, but things like scrotal circumference of the bulls, age at puberty,
those aren't the biggest drivers of fertility. They're not.
No,
it's the environment, it's the nutrition, it's things beyond
body conditions.
See, good point. Because I was stuck on the genetic side. Because honestly, what's most important is age. So the older females come into heat earlier on this per calendar. So
true,
it's
but that's not
just
the
genetics.
biggest. Don't get wrapped up in the small stuff, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just the genetics on health and fertility.
From the Beef Cattle Institute, K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber. To take in the entire podcast, go to beefcattleinstitute.org. Once more, that's beefcattleinstitute.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. U.S. and Chinese envoys held constructive trade talks yesterday, according to the White House. The meeting, aimed at ending a tariff war over trade and technology, ended about 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Neither delegation spoke to reporters before U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin left for the airport. But White House spokeswoman Stephanie Grisham said in a statement hours later that the meetings were constructive and that talks are expected to resume in Washington in September, though the exact dates were not announced. According to the statement, Chinese confirmed their commitment to President Trump to buy more U.S. agricultural exports. Economists had said quick breakthroughs were unlikely because the two governments faced the same disagreements over China's technology policy and trade surplus that caused the talks to break down back in May. Now, President Trump and President Xi Jinping agreed back in June to resume negotiations. Neither, though, has given any sign of offering large concessions. Also yesterday, the news agency Bloomberg presented a somewhat more optimistic report of the talks. It noted that U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators had discussed China's import of agricultural products from the U.S. based on its needs. It cited China's state-run news agency Xinhua's report that the September gathering will include high-level officials. Now, the White House also reported that the talks had included the Chinese side's commitment to increase purchases of U.S. agricultural exports. Relations between the delegates appeared cordial, according to the Media Pool report. The Chinese news agency Xinhua again saying it was a candid, efficient, and constructive exchange on major economic and trade issues. China's Trade Minister Zhang Zhang played a more prominent role in the discussions than in previous rounds, says that report, although his greater involvement has caused concerns among some U.S. delegates as he's perceived as a tougher negotiator. Still, expectations for a breakthrough in the talks have been low, and Bloomberg suggested that the two sides are further apart now than they were 3 months ago when the negotiations broke down and each side blamed the other for derailing the attempts to reach a deal. Brazil's economic minister, Paulo Guedes, said yesterday that country is in official negotiations with the U.S. over a trade deal, as the two largest economies in the Americas look to strengthen ties. Guedes made the announcement following a meeting in Brasilia with U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Guedes said there are still many points of conflict to iron out. The Americans would like to export more ethanol to Brazil, for example, but that would depend on openness to buying more Brazilian sugar, he said. Brazilian sugar producers also make ethanol out of sugarcane, a fuel widely used across that country. President Trump and his Brazilian counterpart have expressed interest in improved relations between the two nations, but have stopped short of announcing official trade talks up until now. Ross did not speak to reporters yesterday, but he's expected to give a public statement on this potential trade deal today. And frustrations with the EPA's handling of the renewable fuels standard boiled over yesterday during a public hearing in Michigan on the latest biofuels volume proposal. Biofuels and agriculture interest groups expressed frustration with the agency's lack of accounting for small refinery waivers and other gallons not reinstated to the RFS despite a federal court order. More than 2.6 billion ethanol equivalent gallons have been waived from RFS requirements since 2016, and about 38 waiver requests are pending before the EPA for 2018. In addition, a federal court ordered the agency to reinstate 500 million gallons withheld by the EPA for the 2016 volumes. In its latest proposal, the EPA said it is not reinstating the 500 million gallons, this despite an order from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Monty Shaw, the executive director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, said he has seen firsthand where the lost demand has meant problems for ethanol producers. Quoting Shaw, simply put, if biofuels in rural America cannot get a square deal on an issue that he says is so completely black and white as the remand, then it's clear we have no hope for fair treatment in areas where the EPA actually does have some discretion. Now it's on to this week's Kansas soybean update. Standing by with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Jen Galloway, Director of Competitions with the Kansas State Fair, joins us. And Jen, as the date gets closer to this year's Kansas State Fair, we're also coming up on deadlines to submit entries. And that includes the Kansas Soybean Commission-sponsored Soybean Plant Show at this year's fair.
Yes, the deadline for entry in that division is August 15th. And these can be done either online at the kansasstatefair.com website or by a paper entry. And if an exhibitor needs any help entering, they just need to call the competitions department here at the Kansas State Fair.
For the producers who would like to enter or are interested in entering the contest by that August 15th deadline, what do the producers need to provide for the contest?
They need to bring in up to 3 entries, and if they have 3, they each have to be from a different variety. And in these entries, they require 5 plants per entry. They suggest to dig up at least 8 to 10 plants when you're doing it so you have a variety to choose from, and they'll want to wash off the roots of the plants, and they will want to make sure that they're in good condition. Once the plants are dried, they're going to loosely tie them together at the base of the plant, at the root system, and then layer them in newspaper to bring to the fair.
When it is judged, what will the judges be looking for?
Mostly they're looking for a more mature plant that's taller with most pods and definitely free from insect damage and disease, no off-color in the leaves, and the plants are uniform, pod size, and fill.
When will the judging take place for the Soybean Plant Show?
They do the judging the first day of the fair, which is Friday, September 6th, and that way they have the results posted for people that are coming through to look at the exhibits, and they can see who got first, second, third, and so on.
And this has been a growing competition that the Kansas Soybean Commission sponsors.
Yes, and we're able to offer some pretty good premiums. We have first place at $30, second place at $25, third at $20, and fourth at $15, and fifth at $10. And then the champion soybean plant in each division will receive $100.
If people are interested in entering, you have to do that by August 15th. They can go to the Kansas State Fair website?
Correct. They can get more information from there, and then if they have any further questions, they can contact us here at the Kansas State Fair in the competitions department.
And that is at kansasstatefair.com. Jen, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That is Jen Galloway, Director of Competitions with the Kansas State Fair, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Welcome back as we move on now to this week's K-State Horticulture segment. And there are pest issues aplenty now in our home vegetable gardens, several of which we'll discuss right here with our guest via phone. Dennis Patton joins us once more. Dennis is the Johnson County Extension Horticultural Agent. Well, Dennis, let's start with disease problems on our tomatoes for openers. We are seeing signs of those foliar pathogens set in, you say.
That is correct. You know, all the rain Kansas has had this year has been wonderful, but with rainy weather and humidity comes leaf diseases, and our tomatoes have 2 issues that hit us every year: septoria leaf spot or early blight of tomatoes. A lot of times we just lump them all together and call them leaf spot diseases, but you can recognize these because they usually start out attacking the lower foliage of the plant, and then as the summer progresses, the leaves just yellow and brown, wither as we go up the plant, and if it gets severe enough, it can cause so much defoliation you don't have enough energy to make fruit for later on in the season.
Right to it. What should one do if they can do anything about that blight, if you will?
Well, you know, on those foliar diseases, prevention is the key, which doesn't always work. But things you can do is make sure you cage your plants, get them up off the ground, make sure there's good airflow, space them wider apart, maybe even remove the side shoots and foliage below the first or second flower cluster, so there's not that ability from the splashing of the ground to get up onto the foliage. Will keep the plants a little bit cleaner. Also removing some of those early suckers keeps the plant thinner, so better airflow. And then if you're going to water the plants, never let them go into the nighttime period wet. So if you water late in the day, flood irrigate at the base, drip irrigation, try to avoid overhead watering. And those cultural practices tend to help, but aren't going to be the magic solution to rid all the problems that potentially could happen with the foliar diseases.
So in that case, fungicides might enter the picture?
That's right. Fungicides, depending on whether you prefer more of a biological, organic control, or chemical, probably the best chemical control is a fungicide called Daconil. That's the over-the-counter name, but the chemical name is chlorothalonil. Most people can say Daconil a lot easier than chlorothalonil, but it's a great broad-spectrum fungicide that works for a lot of things. And then if you want to go the organic ways, you might look at some of the copper-type fungicides, those type of things that might help also.
What else might one be on the lookout for on tomatoes as well?
You know, we've picked up a few reports of spider mites here in the Johnson County area on tomatoes. They usually feed on the top new growth, and they're they're not an insect, they're a mite, which makes them hard to control because our traditional insecticides like 7-malathion can actually make the mite population worse. So a lot of times just a strong spray of water every day for a couple of days up underneath the foliage is a great organic control. And the other problem that we're seeing pop up, which is a little odd on tomatoes, is blister beetles, which is a elongated beetle-like insect, usually kind of ash gray in color, which is kind of a nasty little guy.
Talk about those, for those are something of an abnormality this year in several home gardens, and they're going after tomatoes quite vigorously, as a matter of fact.
Right. Blister beetles will feed on a lot of different plants in the garden, in the landscape, and also in croplands also. And they get their name for a reason, because if they bite you, you get a little blister, so you got to be very careful when you handle them. And they usually are in droves, hordes of them, and they'll eat on the fresh fruit and destroy it. And so then you may need an insecticide spray to help knock those down and decrease the feeding. You know, usually blister beetles last 2-3 weeks, but in a tomato crop, that takes out, really a good chunk of your harvest season if you lose that fruit development.
All right, so those can be extremely aggressive in attacking your tomatoes. One more thing on this particular vegetable crop, you say that you're seeing some specking on the fruit itself. What's that about?
That's right. Here again, all the rains have brought some bacterial speck, so it looks like just a little soft spot where it's maybe rotting in the fruit, a little bit sunken. And here again, the best on that is just to kind of wait it out. Usually, if you catch it early on, it's not that deep, so you just might want to cut it out. Still use the fruit. It's not going to destroy the whole tomato unless it gets really severe on the plant. The fungicides we talked about earlier would also help eliminate that problem also. But a lot of times, the old Kansas adage, you don't like the weather, give it a day, it'll change, usually helps reduce the problems as the fruits go on and mature later in the summer.
Well, let's speak to cucurbit crops for a moment, if we might, and pests that are common out there right now. What are you hearing about, Dennis?
Well, here again, I'm kind of like a broken record, but with the moisture, we're seeing a lot of leaf spot diseases, which defoliate the plants, decrease yield. We are seeing a few cucumber beetles on the cucumber plants. And then, of course, in the squash family, our good old friend, the squash bug and the squash vine borer, are back like every year. And those are some of the most devastating pests we have in the garden, as far as I'm concerned, are those darn squash bugs and squash vine borer that will kill the plants almost immediately.
So an insecticide response would be in order there.
It would be, yes. You can do all the scouting and monitoring for the problem, but once they start to explode, they get really hard to control, so it's better to get them when they're a young stage than an old stage or more mature stage of development, and you can hit them with an insecticide, but you got to be very cautious because they're down at the base of the plant, so if you just kind of go over the top of the foliage, you're not going to get them. You got to stick that nozzle, that wand, down into the plant, because a lot of them are going to be congregating basically at the base of the stem or kind of that center part where it comes out of the ground, and that's where you need to really make sure you get the insecticide thoroughly covering those squash bugs and bring them under control.
On our vining cucurbits, Dennis, cucumbers and the like, could one confuse what some call sun scorch with a disease issue?
They can. Sometimes some fruit will stick out from underneath the vine and the leaf, and on a warm, sunny day, you'll get kind of a whitish discoloration. Cucumbers really do that quite a bit. You'll see where they're burned. The other thing we've seen a little bit of, too, which is a little blossom end rot. We normally think of that as a tomato problem, But you can also pick that up on some of the squash, especially the summer squash, and also some of the peppers and cucumbers too, where that flower end basically just gets all soft and mushy and sunken. And here again, that's a response to our uneven temperatures, uneven moisture we've been having this year. And kind of like on the tomato plant, you just kind of let it grow through it. Some of the fruit still may be edible if you just cut off the infected bad parts. So it may not be perfect looking, but it still may be tasty.
Well, gardeners, stay on the watch for this somewhat wide assortment of pest problems which may show up in your produce here in the coming days and weeks. And Dennis, thanks for the comments right here.
No problem. Glad to visit with you, Eric.
That's from Dennis Patton. He's the Johnson County Extension Horticultural Agent on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. Our time's away. Once again, thanks for tuning in, and please be back with us right here this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.